on quiet nights, when the world has slowed its pace and the air carries a softness that invites rest, stories from long ago rise up like gentle whispers. They come from ancient lands and forgotten kingdoms, carried through centuries not as facts carved into stone, but as tales woven with wonder, caution, and mystery. Among these tales, few shine quite as brightly or tragically as the story of King Midas. His name is still remembered not because of victories in battle or conquests of land, but because of a wish that seemed at first to be a blessing, yet soon revealed itself to be one of the heaviest burdens a man could ever carry. Tonight, we wander slowly into that world, into a time where kings spoke with gods and rivers shimmered with hidden treasures, and we follow the golden path of Midas, whose story reminds us of how easily desire can slip into destruction. The legend of Midas is not simply a tale about riches or a monarch's whim. It is a mirror polished by generations of storytellers, reflecting the unchanging truth that human beings often chase what glitters, without pausing to consider its cost. To listen to his story is to journey into the heart of human longing, our search for more, for abundance, for something beyond what we already hold in our hands. And yet, like so many myths told around flickering fires in ancient villages, the story does not only entertain, it teaches. It lulls us with imagery of golden palaces and sparkling treasures, but it also warns, in a voice that grows quieter and steadier as the story unfolds, that there are dangers hidden beneath the shine. To begin with Midas is to begin with contrast. He was a king of wealth and plenty, yet he longed for more. He had lands and people loyal to him, yet his gaze fell not on what he possessed, but on what lay just out of reach. There is something very human in that restlessness, something that makes the myth feel close even now, thousands of years later. For how often do we, too, find ourselves caught in dreams of more comfort, more security, more sparkle in our days? The story of Midas holds us gently by the hand and guides us through these questions, not with lectures, but with the unfolding of a fable that drifts like a dream, soothing and slow, until the lesson is absorbed without effort, like the warmth of a blanket. It is also a story that sparkles with wonder, as most myths do. There are gods walking among men, mysterious satyrs who laugh and sing in hidden groves, rivers that shimmer with gold dust, and a king who believes, with all his heart, that one gift alone could make his world perfect. This mixture of the ordinary and the extraordinary is part of what makes the tale endure. To the people who first told it, it was not merely entertainment for an evening's fire. It was a story to explain the presence of gold in riverbeds, a story to remind rulers of humility, a story to pass along from parents to children as both comfort and caution. When we tell it now, in the hush of bedtime, we step into that same rhythm, adding our voices to the countless others who have whispered the name of Midas into the night. The introduction to Midas's legend must move slowly, for it is not the kind of tale that should be rushed. The pace must match the gentle unfolding of a dream. We begin with a sense of wonder, allowing ourselves to picture the golden glow of a palace lit by torches, the soft sound of sandals across stone floors, the distant hum of cicadas in a frigid summer. We linger with these images because they prepare the ground for the moment when everything begins to change. In storytelling for rest, it is important to build not only the tale but also the atmosphere, so that the listener can settle deeper into the mood, drifting between wakefulness and sleep as the story stretches onward. So imagine with me the figure of a king, seated on a throne not only of authority but of longing. His robes glimmer, his treasury is filled, his gardens abundant. Yet there is a hollowness that lingers at the edges of his contentment. This, too, feels timeless, for human desire is rarely satisfied. It is this subtle emptiness, this quiet yearning for something greater, that will guide the story forward. And in that yearning, Midas becomes not just a figure of myth, but a reflection of us all, caught between gratitude for what we have and dreams of what we might still gain. As you listen, you might notice the gentle rhythm of the tale echoing your own breathing, steady and slow. The voice of history merges with the voice of myth, creating a soft current that carries you further away from the day's troubles. King Midas is not simply a name in an old book. He is a companion for the night, a reminder of both the wonder and the weight that comes with wishing too much. His story begins in light, in a golden glow of marvel and possibility, but soon it deepens, reminding us that even the brightest gifts may hide the deepest shadows. And so, as this journey begins, we do not rush toward the ending, nor do we focus only on the tragedy to come. We rest first in the gentle glow of possibility, in the dream of a man who wanted more than any man should. We prepare ourselves to walk with him through joy and sorrow, through glittering halls and quiet rivers, through choices and their consequences. Tonight, as the tale unfolds, you may find yourself drifting, carried not only by words but by the calm cadence of time itself, moving backward into a world where kings and gods shared their secrets, and where one man's wish turned a life of plenty into a life of sorrow. This is the legend of King Midas, a story to dream with, a story to rest beside, and a story that glimmers with meaning long after the last word fades into silence. Long before the story of Midas was ever whispered around firelight or etched into the words of poets, there was a land that gave birth to his legend. It was called Phrygia, a kingdom in the heart of Anatolia, what we would now know as part of modern-day Turkey. To imagine the tale properly, we must first imagine that place, because without it the story loses its roots. Phrygia was not merely the backdrop to Midas's life. It was the soil that nourished the myth, the riverbed where gold gleamed, the hills where shepherds played their flutes, and the cities where kings dreamed of greatness. To set the scene is to step gently into an ancient world, one filled with both silence and song, with stretches of fertile land and mountains that seemed to brush the skies. Phrygia, at its height, was a land of contrast. The summers were long and warm, with dry breezes carrying the scent of grain fields, while the winters could be bitter, the earth hard and unyielding. In spring, the land blossomed with wildflowers, and rivers swelled with the snowmelt from far-off peaks. Imagine walking slowly across its plains, hearing the crunch of dry grass beneath sandals, feeling the sun soften as it dipped below the horizon. The capital, Gordion, stood as the heart of this kingdom. From there, kings like Midas ruled not only with authority, but also with the weight of history, for Gordion itself carried mysteries older than any single dynasty. Archaeologists today still speak of its tumuli, great burial mounds that rise from the earth like watchful sentinels. These mounds, covered in grass and earth, conceal chambers built of timber, filled with treasures and offerings to the dead. It is in one of these mounds that scholars believe the remains of a king who may have been the real Midas were laid to rest. Yet in the telling of myths, the land is never simply geography. It is character. Phrygia was a crossroads of worlds, touched by cultures that passed along their stories and their gods. To the west lay Lydia, famed for its wealth and the birth of coinage. To the east stretched empires that carried with them tales and traditions. The Greeks, whose mythology would absorb and reshape the legend of Midas, looked toward Phrygia as a land at once exotic and familiar, distant but not unreachable. The Phrygians themselves were skilled in music and craft. Their wool was prized, their woven garments sought after, their musicians remembered even in Greek stories. To picture this kingdom is to picture not only landscapes, but also sounds. The delicate notes of the Phrygian mode, a musical scale so haunting that it traveled into the hearts of Greek composers, echoing through temples and theaters long after Phrygia itself faded. In bedtime storytelling, we do not rush through these details. We linger on them, letting the imagination build layer by layer. The fields of Phrygia stretch out endlessly in the mind's eye, dotted with shepherds guiding their flocks. In the distance, smoke rises lazily from village hearths. In Gordion, craftsmen bend over their work, shaping wood, metal, and cloth into objects of beauty. At the royal court, banquets are prepared, with platters of bread, olives, and wine. The laughter of courtiers mixes with the cautious whispers of advisors. This was the environment in which Midas lived, and understanding it allows us to better understand the man who would one day ask for gold in place of bread, who would one day trade the warmth of his family for the glitter of treasure. It is also in Phrygia that we encounter stories beyond Midas himself. The Phrygians were known in Greek imagination as the people connected with the great puzzle of the Gordian knot. This legendary knot, tied in the chariot of an ancient king, was said to be impossible to untangle. It was prophesied that whoever could unravel it would rule all of Asia. Centuries later, Alexander the Great would cut through it with his sword, a bold act that symbolized his destiny. These layers of story show us how Phrygia was seen not only as a land of kings, but as a land of mysteries and fates. To set the scene here is to step into a land already heavy with story before Midas even makes his entrance. The rivers of Phrygia deserve special mention, for they were not only lifelines for its people, but also the very stage upon which parts of the Midas legend played out. Chief among them was the Pactolus, whose sands shimmered with particles of gold. To the ancient mind, such a river could not be merely a natural phenomenon. It must have been touched by the divine, connected to a tale greater than the human eye could see. Later, storytellers would weave into the legend of Midas the image of him washing away his cursed gift in this very river, explaining why its waters carried the gleam of wealth. This is how myths worked. They turned the features of the land into poetry, giving meaning to every mountain and stream. And so, the Pactolus was not just a river. It was a flowing reminder of the dangers of human desire and the mercy of gods. When we speak of ancient kingdoms in this gentle, bedtime tone, it is tempting to imagine them as entirely serene, untouched by conflict. Yet Phrygia, like any kingdom, saw its share of struggles. It rose in power after the decline of the Hittite Empire, carving its place in Anatolia, only to one day fall to foreign invaders. But for the purpose of our story, those battles remain distant echoes, softened by time. We are not concerned with the clamor of war, but with the quiet essence of the land itself. The people of Phrygia lived ordinary lives, farmers tending fields, shepherds watching flocks, women spinning wool, children playing in dusty courtyards. Their days were marked by the rising and setting of the sun, by festivals in honor of their gods, by the cycles of planting and harvest. To imagine these lives is to ground the myth in reality, to remind us that even the most dazzling stories sprout from the soil of human existence. And so, as we set the stage, we can see how Phrygia was both real and mythic, both a kingdom of history and a kingdom of imagination. It was a place where gold lay hidden in rivers, where knots foretold destinies, where music carried the soul to distant realms, and where a king would one day learn the cost of longing for too much. In this land of contrast and beauty, of wealth and simplicity, the seeds of the Midas story took root. And as we move forward into his legend, we carry with us this setting like a soft backdrop, a canvas painted with fields and rivers, palaces and villages, music and silence. Phrygia is more than the stage of Midas's tale. It is a character in its own right, quietly shaping the destiny of its king. And now, as the night deepens and our story draws us further in, the land itself fades gently into the background, making way for the figure of Midas, who will soon step forward, full of dreams, full of longing, and unaware of the golden shadow that waits ahead. When we hear the name of King Midas, the image that comes to mind is almost always the same. A figure cloaked in regal garments, his hands glowing with golden light, everything he touches transformed into treasure. Yet, like so many figures who stand halfway between history and myth, the truth of Midas is more complex, more uncertain, and perhaps more fascinating because of it. To understand the man behind the legend, we must wander carefully through the fragile traces of history, while still allowing the soft voice of storytelling to carry us deeper into the dream. For the world of Midas is not fixed. It shifts and changes depending on who is telling the story, and each version adds a layer of mystery to the king whose name has never faded from memory. Historians tell us that Midas may not have been a single person at all, but rather several kings who ruled Phrygia over different generations, their identities blurring into one another until the line between fact and fable dissolved. Ancient records suggest that one Midas reigned during the late 8th century BCE, a time when Phrygia was strong and influential, trading with neighbors and asserting itself as a regional power. In Assyrian inscriptions, there is mention of a king called Midas of Mushki, a ruler whose name and time seem to align with the Phrygian Midas. This connection hints at a living figure who wielded real political influence, negotiating with empires, raising armies, and overseeing a land rich in culture and trade. But while the clay tablets of Assyria speak of treaties and conflicts, the myths of Greece transformed him into something far more symbolic, a man remembered not for governance, but for his fateful wish. Archaeology has offered its own quiet clues. In Gordion, the capital of Phrygia, lies the largest burial mound in Anatolia, known as Tumulus MM. Within its wooden chamber, excavators found the remains of a man who may have been a Midas, or perhaps his father. The tomb was filled with offerings, bronze cauldrons, wooden furniture, and the remains of a lavish funeral feast. To stand in that chamber today, or even to imagine it, is to sense both the grandeur and the solemnity of ancient kingship. Whoever was buried there, he was honored with immense ceremony, his memory preserved not only in myth, but also in the earth itself. And yet, no matter how carefully scholars measure and analyze, they cannot separate the myth entirely from the man. The legend of Midas wraps itself around history like ivy, obscuring clear lines, reminding us that sometimes the most enduring truths are those clothed in story. Greek mythology was eager to claim Midas, reshaping him to suit its own moral lessons. In the hands of Greek poets, he became less a ruler of a distant land and more a figure who embodied human flaws, greed, vanity, poor judgment. This transformation was not unusual, for the Greeks often absorbed the stories of neighboring peoples, weaving them into their vast tapestry of gods, heroes, and cautionary tales. In this way, the real king of Phrygia became something larger than life, a symbol carried across centuries and cultures. His wealth and power were remembered, yes, but they were remembered through the lens of myth, colored by imagination and moral teaching. There is also the possibility that Midas himself, or the rulers who bore his name, contributed to the shaping of the legend. Ancient kings often encouraged myths about themselves, for such stories magnified their presence and secured their place in memory. To be remembered not merely as a ruler, but as a near-mythical figure was to achieve a form of immortality. And so, whether Midas himself believed in the golden touch or whether later generations created it around him, the result was the same, a story too vivid to be forgotten. But who, then, was Midas as a man? Was he a ruler torn between the duties of governance and the temptations of wealth? Was he a wise king remembered unfairly through tales of folly? Or was he a mythic creation, pieced together from fragments of history and embellished for the sake of storytelling? Perhaps the truest answer lies somewhere in between. He was real enough to appear in foreign records, real enough to leave behind burial mounds and treasures, yet at the same time, he was reshaped into a character of legend, his name forever tied to the shimmer of gold. It is important, too, to notice how the myth emphasizes not the glory of Midas's reign but the flaws of his desires. We are not told in detail of his battles or his governance, but rather of a single choice, a single wish that revealed something universal about the human heart. In this way, Midas is less a king on a throne and more a mirror held up to us all. For who has not, at some point, wished for something that seemed to promise happiness, only to discover its hidden cost? Who has not dreamed of wealth, power, or abundance, believing it would bring fulfillment, only to realize that it might instead bring weight, responsibility, or emptiness? This is why the myth has lasted so long. It speaks not only of a man, but of the condition of being human. Whether or not Midas ever truly lived exactly as the stories describe, he lives on within us as a symbol of yearning. His hands reaching for gold are our hands reaching for whatever we believe will finally complete us. His sorrow is our sorrow when the things we chase turn to burdens rather than blessings. And in this way, the figure of Midas continues to walk beside us, as real in imagination as he ever was in flesh. When we think of him in the quiet of the night, it is less important to pin down the precise details of his biography than to rest in the story itself. The myths were never meant to serve as history books. They were meant to serve as gentle guides, stories that unfold with rhythm and meaning, shaping the way people thought about life, desire, and consequence. For the listener drifting into slumber, Midas becomes not only a king of ancient Phrygia, but also a guide into the deeper layers of the self. His story begins to glow softly in the imagination, like candlelight, inviting reflection without demand, opening a doorway into dreams. And so, in setting Midas before us, we prepare ourselves for the legend to come. He is not just the man who touched gold, but the man who represents the fragile balance between want and wisdom. He is a king whose story has been carried across centuries, retold by poets, painted by artists, remembered by children. He is a bridge between fact and fable, between the world of history and the world of myth. And as we move deeper into his tale, we will see not only the marvel of his wish, but also the sorrow that followed. For in the figure of Midas, we see how a single desire can transform a life, how the line between fortune and curse is sometimes as thin as a whisper, and how the man behind the myth still lingers, waiting for us to listen. When myths cross borders, they rarely remain unchanged. They take on the colors of the cultures that adopt them, reshaped into forms that suit the lessons, the values, and the imaginations of new storytellers. The figure of King Midas, though rooted in the soil of Phrygia, found himself transformed within the mythology of Greece. It was there, among the divine tales of gods and mortals, that his legend grew into the story we most often remember, the story of the golden touch and the peril of desires left unchecked. To understand how Midas came to meet the gods of Greece, we must wander gently into that mythic realm, where satyrs danced in the forests, where Dionysus walked among men, and where the boundary between the divine and the human was as thin as the veil between waking and dreams. The Greeks were masters of storytelling. Their myths were not just entertainment. They were lessons wrapped in wonder, teaching through metaphor what could not be explained through reason alone. They looked out at the world, at rivers glinting with gold, at kings crowned in splendor, and they wove these sights into narratives of gods bestowing gifts and mortals receiving punishments. In this way, Midas became less an Anatolian king and more a character within a Greek moral drama. He was shaped into an example, someone whose choices could be used to illustrate truths about greed, about wisdom, and about the delicate balance between mortal and divine. At the center of this transformation was Dionysus, the god of wine, revelry, and the ecstatic forces of nature. Dionysus was unlike many of the other Olympians. While Zeus thundered from the skies and Apollo glowed with rational light, Dionysus represented something more primal, more intoxicating. He was the god of excess, of passion, of release. His followers filled the forests with music and dancing, with the clamor of drums and the haunting notes of the flute. They drank deeply of wine, not merely as a drink, but as a doorway to the divine. To the Greeks, Dionysus symbolized the wild, untamable side of existence, the part of life that breaks through order and spills into ecstasy. It was into this world that Midas's story was placed. The myth tells us that one day, the companions of Dionysus, his satyrs, wandered into Phrygia. Satyrs were creatures of mischief, half man and half goat, with the hooves of animals and the laughter of tricksters. They played music, sang songs, and followed Dionysus in endless celebration. Among them was Silenus, the oldest and wisest of the group, a satyr known for his knowledge of hidden truths as well as his fondness for wine. Silenus, in the story, strayed from his companions and was found by the servants of King Midas. Imagine the scene: a satyr, weary from wine and wandering, discovered in a foreign land. Instead of punishing or mocking him, Midas treated Silenus with kindness. The king welcomed him, offered him rest, and entertained him for days, perhaps listening to his tales of the gods, of the secrets of the earth, of the mysteries that only the companions of Dionysus would know. This act of hospitality, so simple and so human, would become the hinge upon which Midas's fate would turn. When at last Midas returned Silenus to Dionysus, the god was grateful. To reward the king's generosity, Dionysus offered him a gift, anything he desired. It is here that the story pauses, as if holding its breath, for what Midas chooses reveals more about his heart than anything else. Some might have wished for wisdom, others for peace, others still for long life. But Midas, already a man of wealth and abundance, longed for more. He asked that everything he touched might turn into gold. The Greeks told this part of the story with a sense of inevitability. For in their myths, gifts from the gods were never simple, and wishes often carried hidden curses. Dionysus granted Midas his request, perhaps with a knowing smile, for the gods rarely gave without teaching. And so, the touch of Midas was transformed. His hands became instruments of transmutation, turning wood into gold, stone into gold, food into gold, and even the petals of flowers into solid, lifeless metal. This mythic connection between Midas and Dionysus reveals much about how the Greeks understood both wealth and desire. Gold, in their imagination, was dazzling but dangerous. It could build temples and kingdoms, but it could also corrupt and consume. By placing Midas in the company of Dionysus, the Greeks framed his wish as part of a broader theme: the danger of excess, the peril of indulgence without wisdom. Dionysus himself embodied this paradox. Wine could bring joy, but too much could bring madness. Celebration could bring unity, but too much could lead to chaos. In the same way, gold could represent prosperity, but too much of it could destroy the very life it was meant to enrich. And yet, the story retains a softness when told at night. It is not merely a tale of punishment, but a tale of humanity, of a man who asked for something dazzling and discovered its shadow. The gods in Greek myth were not distant and silent. They were woven into the fabric of human life, shaping destinies, testing mortals, guiding them through trials. By meeting Dionysus, Midas stepped into that divine theater, becoming a character in a cosmic lesson, one that would be told and retold long after his reign was forgotten. To picture this meeting is to picture a blending of worlds. A Phrygian king in his palace, a wandering satyr speaking truths half hidden in riddles, a god who rewards kindness with a gift too bright to bear. It is a story that carries both warmth and warning, reminding us of the bond between the mortal and the divine. For the Greeks, this was the heart of myth. The gods were never far away, and the choices of men were never without consequence. And so, in the calm of night, as we let the story unfold like the gentle flicker of a lamp, we see Midas not only as a ruler of a distant land, but as a figure chosen by the gods to carry a lesson. His kindness to Silenus brought him favor, but his desire brought him sorrow. His connection to Dionysus wove him into the fabric of Greek mythology, ensuring that his story would live far beyond his kingdom, shimmering in the golden light of memory. The Greek connection does not erase the Phrygian roots of Midas, but enriches them, placing him at the crossroads of cultures and reminding us of how myths grow when they travel. And as this part of the story closes, we stand on the threshold of the golden touch itself, ready to see how Midas's wish, granted by a god, would shape the rest of his life. The meeting of man and God has been made, the stage set, the gift bestowed. What follows will be both wonder and tragedy, a journey glittering with gold, but heavy with consequence. When dawn breaks upon the palace of Midas, the air feels somehow different, though the sky itself remains unchanged. The king rises with the same thoughts as any ruler might: matters of governance, matters of comfort, the simple rhythm of another day beginning. Yet within him stirs a quiet anticipation, for he remembers the gift he was granted by the god Dionysus, a gift that seemed at first like a dream whispered into waking life. The promise of gold, not mined or forged, but born at the touch of his own hands. It is one thing to wish for such a power, and another entirely to feel it quicken within you. The first test is small, almost hesitant, as if Midas cannot quite believe what has been given to him. He reaches for a simple object, perhaps the arm of a chair, perhaps a branch in the palace garden. The moment his fingers brush against the surface, the transformation unfolds. The wood stiffens, hardens, and then shines with a brilliance unlike anything fashioned by mortal craftsmen. What had been ordinary is now golden, heavy and gleaming in the morning light. Midas draws back his hand, breath catching in wonder, for the promise was true. He touches again, and again the magic surges. Each contact remakes the world, layering it in splendor, draping it in the sheen of immortality. Imagine the delight of such a moment, the sudden abundance, the feeling that one has command over the very fabric of matter. For a king who had already known riches, this was more than wealth. It was divinity itself made tangible. Midas laughs, perhaps softly at first, then louder, as he tests the reach of his power. The edge of a stone table, the stem of a flower, even the soft fabric of his robe, each one stiffens into gold, cold and shining. His halls, once filled with color and texture, begin to glitter like a treasure hoard. Word spreads quickly, for servants and attendants cannot help but notice the miracles unfolding before their eyes. They whisper of the king's new blessing, their voices carrying wonder, envy, perhaps even fear. For what does it mean to serve a man who can turn the world itself into treasure? Some bow deeper, eager to be near the glow of fortune. Others shrink back, unsettled by the strangeness of it, uncertain whether to view it as a blessing of the gods or a curse in disguise. But Midas himself, in these first hours, feels only triumph. He strides through his palace as though he has been chosen above all others, as though he has become more than mortal. The golden touch is not simply wealth, it is transformation. To Midas, it feels like proof of his importance, a sign that the gods have marked him for greatness. He imagines the power it will bring: tribute from neighboring kingdoms, respect from his subjects, fear from his enemies. Gold, after all, is the language of kings, and he now speaks it fluently with every gesture of his hand. He dreams of entire cities remade in gold, of temples that shine so brightly they rival the heavens themselves. And yet, amid his elation, subtle shadows begin to form. At first, they are no more than inconveniences. When he takes a piece of bread at his table, it hardens into metal, unyielding to his teeth. When he lifts a goblet of wine, the liquid stiffens into a solid mass before it can touch his lips. Midas laughs again, though more uncertainly this time, and sets them aside. Surely there will be ways around such minor troubles. Surely the gift of a god could not become a burden. But in the quiet spaces of his mind, he begins to sense the edges of a dilemma. Still, in these first days, the wonder outweighs the worry. Midas walks through his gardens and touches the leaves, watching them shimmer into gold. He trails his hand along the marble walls, and the veins of the stone glow brighter, richer, as if kissed by the sun. He feels like an artist painting the world in a single hue, a hue that speaks of glory, permanence, and power. His courtiers marvel at the transformation, bowing as though in worship, for to them too it seems as though the king has ascended into the realm of legends. But legends are never without their cost, and the Greeks who told this story knew well how quickly gifts could turn into trials. For now, though, we rest with Midas in his newfound joy. We see him moving through his halls, each step a reminder of his altered fate. He lifts objects, treasures them, and sets them down again, surrounded by a glow that both comforts and unsettles. His palace grows heavier, the air filled with the cold gleam of metal, yet his heart swells with pride. There is, within this moment, a dreamlike quality. The world has shifted, yet it has not collapsed. The balance still holds, though it trembles beneath the weight of excess. Midas does not yet see the full path of his wish. He sees only its beginning, golden and bright, as though the horizon has opened into endless possibility. He cannot yet imagine the hunger that will gnaw at him when food turns to metal, the loneliness that will follow when even a hand extended in love becomes a lifeless statue. These things are hidden for now, as the story lingers in its golden dawn. The beauty of this myth lies in its pacing. The Greeks, in telling it, allowed their listeners to share in Midas's wonder before they revealed his despair. And so, too, as we let the tale drift through our thoughts in the quiet of night, we savor this first flush of enchantment. We imagine what it would feel like to hold such a gift, to see the world remade by our own touch. We understand the thrill, the pride, the sense of limitless power. And perhaps, as we listen, we feel the faint tremor of caution, knowing as the storytellers did that light too bright will always cast a shadow. For now, Midas is content. He touches, and gold blossoms beneath his fingers. He laughs, and the sound rings against the golden walls. He dreams, and his dreams gleam as brightly as the treasures he has created. The golden touch has begun, and with it begins the journey that will carry him from wonder into sorrow, from triumph into humility. The gift has been given, and its true meaning waits to be revealed. The brilliance of gold, though dazzling in the sunlight, cannot fill the emptiness of a human stomach. It cannot quench the dryness of a parched throat. Midas, in those early days of wonder, discovered this truth not all at once, but gradually, as hunger crept upon him like a shadow lengthening with the day. At first, he was too caught up in the marvel of his gift to notice the pangs. His hands were busy transforming the world, his mind busy dreaming of what might be built from the wealth that poured from his very fingertips. But the body has its own way of reminding us of our limits. And no matter how splendid a palace may be, a man still requires bread, fruit, and wine to live. The first attempt at a meal must have seemed like a small test, one he surely thought would be easily solved. Picture Midas seated at his great table, dishes prepared and set before him. The food was fresh, steaming with the scents of the kitchen, the kind of simple fare that nourishes more than it impresses. He reached out, confident, perhaps even smiling. But the moment his fingers closed upon a loaf of bread, the crust hardened, the softness vanished, and the warm loaf turned to rigid metal, cold and unyielding. He tried to break it, perhaps, only to find it shattered into golden shards that glittered on the table like mockery. Still, he did not despair immediately. He lifted a piece of fruit, ripe and sweet, and perhaps told himself that it would be different. But the skin stiffened in his palm, turning heavy, the juices sealed away behind a shell of gold. He brought it to his lips, but his teeth met only hardness. What should have been nourishment had become a treasure too solid to consume. Perhaps a servant brought wine, poured fresh into a goblet. Midas raised it, hoping at least to drink, to ease the dryness in his throat. But as the liquid touched the rim of his cup, it froze, not into ice but into solid metal, thick and unyielding. When he tilted the goblet, nothing poured forth, for the wine had lost its flow, its essence caught in the grip of the golden curse. It was then, in the quiet of that dining hall, that the realization began to dawn. Wealth could not feed him. Riches could not keep him alive. He who had once commanded abundance now sat before a table heavy with food that mocked him, food that glistened but could never be eaten. The pangs of hunger grew sharper, the thirst more insistent, and the weight of the gift began to press upon him in ways no crown ever had. The Greeks who told this story often lingered on this moment, for it is in contrast that lessons are best learned. What greater contrast could there be than between abundance and lack, between a table full of food and a stomach empty, between goblets brimming and a mouth dry with thirst? To those who heard the tale, it became a meditation on the true nature of wealth. What is gold, after all, if it cannot sustain life? What value does treasure have if it cannot soothe hunger or quench thirst? Midas, once so proud, now moved more carefully through his halls. Every object he touched bore the mark of his curse, and so he tried to withhold his hand. But how does one withhold touch from the world entirely? The human body is not meant for such restraint. To reach, to hold, to comfort, these are instincts as natural as breath. Yet each time he forgot himself, something else was lost to him, turned to a lifeless form that glittered but gave nothing back. It must have been a lonely realization. For what is more isolating than to know that the very act of reaching for sustenance, of grasping what sustains life, is denied? In the silence of his palace, he must have begun to feel the hollow ache of despair. The walls around him gleamed brighter, but the light no longer brought him joy. The gardens shone with metal leaves, but their fragrance was gone. The fountains sparkled like sculpture, but no water flowed for his thirst. All beauty had become illusion, a surface that deceived, a surface that could not nourish. In the calm rhythm of storytelling, we pause here to imagine the sensation. To lift food and feel it grow cold, to lift wine and find it hardened, to look upon a feast and know it is beyond reach. These are the moments when a gift reveals itself as a curse. It is not sudden lightning that strikes, not fire that consumes, but a slow dawning, a creeping awareness that what was desired most has hollowed out the simple joys of life. And so Midas began to wither in spirit, even as his halls grew richer. The laughter that once echoed through his rooms grew quieter, the music of his court muted by unease. His servants, too, must have whispered among themselves, for what is a king who cannot eat, who cannot drink? Some must have feared for him, others perhaps feared him, for his very presence carried danger. And he himself must have wondered, in the silence of his chambers, how long a man could live surrounded by treasure but starved of the simplest needs. The lesson here is subtle yet profound. The Greeks, with their love of balance and moderation, understood that extremes bring ruin. To desire wealth above all else was, in their eyes, to lose sight of the things that sustain life, food, drink, companionship, love. Gold could decorate a temple, could pay soldiers, could build ships. But it could not nourish the body, nor soothe the soul. By making Midas discover this truth through hunger and thirst, the storytellers gave weight to their warning. It was not enough to say that greed was dangerous. They showed it in the most human terms imaginable. The hunger of Midas was not just physical, though. It was spiritual. For hunger is a reminder of our need, of our dependence upon the world and upon others. To be unable to eat is to be cut off from the cycle of giving and receiving that defines human life. To be unable to drink is to feel the severing of one's place within the living world. And Midas, in his golden halls, must have felt that severing keenly. His power, once so dazzling, had left him isolated, his hands no longer capable of grasping what was most essential. And yet, as the myth unfolds, we do not linger in despair forever. Myths, like dreams, carry us through darkness toward a resolution, even if that resolution is not always gentle. For now, though, we remain in the quiet ache of his hunger, in the dryness of his thirst. We sit with Midas as he realizes that his gift has betrayed him, that the very thing he longed for has stripped him of the simplest joys. The tale slows here, as it must, to let the weight of the moment sink in. We imagine the empty stomach, the dry throat, the eyes that look upon food and see only futility. And in this slow rhythm, we too are invited to reflect, to breathe, to understand what it means to long for what we cannot have. The story becomes a mirror, not only of Midas but of us, of every desire that has ever turned hollow in our hands. Hunger and thirst had already begun to gnaw at Midas's body, but the cruelest revelation of his gift did not come from food or drink. It came from love. For while a man can endure hunger a little longer, can bear thirst for some time, what he cannot endure is the loneliness that comes from being unable to hold those he loves. The curse of the golden touch revealed its true weight not at the table, but in the tender spaces of his life, in the quiet moments where touch is not luxury, but necessity. The story often tells us that Midas had a daughter, a child who was dear to him. Some versions name her, others do not. But what matters is not the name, it is the bond. A daughter, full of life and innocence, who would have run to her father with the unguarded love of youth. In her, the king found joy beyond the riches of his palace, for love between parent and child is richer than any treasure. And it was this love that his golden gift destroyed. Imagine the moment. The girl rushing toward him, perhaps laughing, perhaps with arms outstretched, seeking nothing more than the embrace of her father. Midas, weakened by hunger and parched with thirst, must have longed for comfort himself. He must have bent toward her, reaching as instinct compels us to do, his heart yearning for the simple warmth of her closeness. But when his hands closed around her, when he pulled her into his arms, the curse did its work with unfeeling precision. Her laughter ceased, her warmth vanished, her living form hardened beneath his grip. What had been flesh became metal. What had been motion became stillness. What had been a child's breath against his chest became silence. He looked, and where his daughter had been, there now stood a statue of gold, perfect in detail, lifeless in essence. The shine was brilliant, the artistry unmatched, yet the price was unbearable. Midas had turned love into treasure, and in so doing had lost what no wealth could replace. This moment, more than any feast turned to stone, more than any goblet frozen in his hand, was the true heart of his tragedy. The Greeks told it to remind listeners that wealth pursued without wisdom leads not only to the loss of sustenance, but to the loss of love. Gold may glitter, but it cannot laugh, it cannot embrace, it cannot return affection. In his daughter's transmutation, Midas saw the full cruelty of his desire, the way it stripped life of its warmth and reduced it to lifeless beauty. We may imagine his cry, echoing through the golden halls, a sound of anguish too deep to be contained. Servants might have gathered, horrified but helpless, their eyes darting between the gleaming statue and the broken man before it. For what could they do? No one could reverse the gift of a god save the god himself. And Midas, who once laughed at his power, now wept at his helplessness. The tragedy of touch reaches beyond the myth. For even as listeners drift toward sleep with the story unfolding, they feel the weight of its meaning. Touch is one of the simplest, most human acts. It conveys love, comfort, reassurance, connection. To be denied it is to be set apart from the world, encased in loneliness as rigid as stone. Midas, in his palace, now stood not as a man surrounded by riches, but as a man imprisoned by them. Each gesture carried danger. Each moment of affection carried risk. To reach for anything living was to destroy it. There is a cruel irony in how myths work. Midas wished for abundance, and abundance was given, but at the cost of intimacy. He wished for splendor, and splendor was given, but at the cost of warmth. The gods, in granting wishes, always taught their lessons through balance turned upside down. And so the greatest gift became the greatest sorrow, the brightest treasure became the darkest prison. The image of a golden child standing still in a hall that echoes with silence is one that lingers. It lingers because it strikes at the heart of human longing. We desire wealth, but we desire love more deeply. We may chase treasure, but we return always to the arms of those we cherish. To see that embrace, turned to metal, is to see the hollowness of gold laid bare. The Greeks, who knew the weight of both poverty and prosperity, wrapped this truth in the image of Midas and his daughter, ensuring that listeners would remember it not as an abstract lesson, but as a vivid story. And in the stillness of night, when this tale is told for rest and reflection, the lesson softens into a whisper. It is not shouted as a warning but breathed as a truth. What you touch may shine, but if it costs you love, it is no blessing. To hear this in the quiet, as one drifts toward dreams, is to feel the truth sink gently into the heart, not with fear, but with recognition. Midas, broken, likely fell to his knees before the golden form of his daughter. Perhaps he spoke to her, though no sound returned. Perhaps he reached again, desperate, only to recoil as he realized that further touch could only deepen the damage. His grief must have filled the palace, must have spread like a shadow across every glittering surface. For what joy could he take in gold now, when it stared back at him in the shape of his child? And so the gift that began with laughter now brought only tears. The man who had once seen himself as chosen by the gods now felt cursed, abandoned, punished. His pride dissolved into desperation, his wealth into wretchedness. In the turning of his daughter, the lesson was complete. He had asked for too much, and he had received it. And now he would give anything, anything at all, to undo it. It is here that the myth bends toward its next stage, toward the moment of supplication, when Midas will cast aside pride and beg the gods for mercy. But before that, we linger with him in the ache of loss. We sit with the silence of the golden statue, with the emptiness of a hall once filled with laughter. We imagine the stillness, the shine that blinds rather than warms, the weight of regret pressing heavier than any crown of gold. For in the rhythm of bedtime storytelling, it is not only the lesson that matters, but the slowing, the soft cadence that carries the listener toward reflection. We breathe with Midas in his sorrow. We see with him the hollowness of his gift, and we, too, learn the quiet truth that wealth without love is no wealth at all. When sorrow grows too heavy for mortal shoulders, the heart turns upward, seeking mercy beyond what this world can give. Midas, once proud and radiant in his golden halls, now found himself bowed beneath the weight of despair. Hunger gnawed at him, thirst burned within him, and grief hollowed him from within. The glittering form of his daughter stood before him, unyielding and silent, a constant reminder of what his desire had cost. The laughter of the palace was gone, replaced by echoes that rang against golden walls like mockery. And so, with pride broken and arrogance dissolved, he did what mortals in myth so often must. He turned to the gods. The Greeks who told this tale knew well that the gods were not easily moved. They were capricious, unpredictable, their gifts as dangerous as their punishments. Yet they also taught that humility, that rare and difficult virtue, could sometimes soften divine hearts. For only when a man recognized his limits, only when he confessed his weakness, could he truly be heard. Midas, who had once seen himself as nearly divine in his power, now saw himself as nothing more than a desperate man, stripped of joy, pleading for life itself. He left his palace, so heavy now with lifeless splendor, and stepped into the world beyond its gates. The air was still, the earth dry beneath his feet, Yet for the first time in days he walked without seeking to touch, without longing to transform. Each step was careful, almost reverent, as though he feared that even the soil might harden beneath him. His robes, once a symbol of wealth, now felt like chains, heavy with the cold gleam of his curse. He carried nothing with him but his grief and his hope, fragile though it was. In myth, the journey to the gods is not always physical. It is often inward, a pilgrimage of the spirit. But the storytellers also wove paths into the land itself. They said that Midas, guided by regret, made his way to the temple of Dionysus, the god who had granted his wish. Perhaps he fell along the road, weak from hunger, his steps uneven, his body trembling with exhaustion. Perhaps he whispered prayers as he walked, words broken by sobs, words that pleaded not for riches, not for glory, but for release. Each plea rose into the sky like smoke, carrying the weight of a man's broken heart. When at last he reached the sacred place, he cast himself down before the altar. There, surrounded by offerings from others, grapes, wine, garlands, tokens of joy, he looked at his own hands, those cursed instruments, and wept. His voice, heavy with grief, rose into the stillness of the temple. He called upon Dionysus, the god of revelry and life, the god who had once smiled upon him. He confessed his folly, admitted the vanity of his wish, and begged for forgiveness. He asked not for treasures, not for crowns, but for freedom, from hunger, from thirst, from the cold prison of his touch. The prayer of Midas must have been long, each word dragging from him like a stone lifted from the depths of his heart. He admitted what few kings ever do, that he was powerless, that he was weak, that he had been wrong. And this, more than any act of strength, was what moved the gods in stories. For humility is the doorway to grace, and only when a man bends does the divine stoop to lift him. The silence of the temple stretched, deep and heavy. Perhaps he feared he had not been heard, that the god would ignore him, that his punishment would last until death itself. But then, as in many myths, the divine presence stirred. Whether it was a voice that filled the air, or a vision that shimmered before him, or simply a knowing within his heart, Dionysus answered. The god, both joyous and terrible, did not scold or mock him. Instead, he offered a path to redemption, a way to cleanse the curse that had nearly destroyed him. Go, the voice might have said, calm yet resonant, to the river that flows swift and eternal. Wash your hands in its waters, and the touch that turns life to gold shall be washed away. The gift you sought has shown its weight. Now you are free to choose life over treasure, love over wealth. In this moment, the myth shifts from tragedy to hope. The plea had been heard, the gods had answered, and the chance for restoration lay ahead. Midas, though still weary and broken, felt the faint stirring of relief. He had been given another chance, not because he was a king, not because he was rich, but because he had humbled himself. The gods, in their strange mercy, had shown him a way forward. The Greeks who told this tale wanted their listeners to hear more than just the surface of the story. They wanted them to understand that even the greatest mistakes can be met with forgiveness when one turns away from pride. They wanted them to know that despair does not always end in darkness, that sometimes it bends toward light. And in the quiet rhythm of bedtime storytelling, this part of the myth settles gently, offering reassurance as the listener drifts deeper into calm reflection. Midas, still heavy with sorrow, rose from the altar. His tears still glistened, but in them now was a spark of hope. He set out once again, this time toward the river, his steps steadier than before. He did not know what awaited him there, but he knew he had been heard. And in that knowledge, he carried a peace he had not felt since the moment his wish was granted. For the plea to the gods had not only opened the way to redemption, it had reminded him of what truly mattered. Not wealth, not splendor, not the glitter of gold, but life itself, love itself, the simple warmth of touch untainted by greed. His prayer had reshaped him, humbled him, and in that humility, he found a strength greater than all his treasures. And so, as the story flows onward, we leave Midas on the path to the river, carrying within him both sorrow and hope. His journey is not yet complete, but the turning point has come. The gift has been revealed as a curse. The curse has driven him to prayer, and the prayer has brought him the mercy of the gods. What follows will be the cleansing, the restoration, and the lesson that endures long after the man himself has faded into myth. The path to the river was long, though not measured in distance alone. For every step Midas took upon the earth was also a step inward, a journey of the spirit as much as of the body. The world around him seemed to hold its breath. The trees bent slightly as if in quiet witness, their leaves whispering faintly in the wind. The sky stretched wide above him, pale and endless, carrying the weight of time itself. And before him, though unseen at first, lay the promise of flowing water, a place where his curse might be lifted. He walked with careful steps, still fearful of what his touch might do. When his hand brushed a low branch, he pulled back in alarm, but the bark remained as it was. Perhaps the curse was already growing weaker in anticipation of what was to come, or perhaps it was simply that Midas had grown so wary that he hardly dared to touch anything at all. His heart was heavy, yet there was also a thread of hope woven through it, thin but steady, like a candle flame in the dark. In myths, rivers are more than rivers. They are thresholds, boundaries, and channels between worlds. Some carry souls to the underworld, some mark the edges of kingdoms, some cleanse sins or curses. The river that Dionysus named for Midas was such a one, no ordinary stream, but a current of divine power, flowing endlessly, carrying with it both memory and forgetting. To bathe in its waters was to be renewed, to let the past drift away like leaves upon its surface. When at last Midas heard the sound of rushing water, it was like music to his ears. After days of silence, of hollow halls and lifeless gold, the song of the river felt alive. It bubbled and murmured, whispering of freedom, of cleansing, of release. He stumbled forward, his pace quickening despite his weariness, and soon he stood upon its banks. The sight filled his eyes with wonder. The waters gleamed beneath the light, clear and swift, dancing over stones that seemed to shimmer faintly, as though touched by divine light. He fell to his knees at the edge, overcome with both relief and reverence. His reflection trembled upon the surface, a face lined with grief, eyes weary from sleepless nights, features hardened by sorrow. Yet even as he gazed upon it, he felt the invitation of the current, urging him to let go. With trembling hands, he reached toward the water. Fear caught him for a moment. What if his touch cursed even this sacred stream? What if the gift of Dionysus proved as cruel as before? But the god had spoken, and in the stillness of his heart, Midas knew he must trust. Slowly, gently, he dipped his hands into the river. The water was cool, flowing over his skin with a touch that was neither heavy nor harsh, but soft and cleansing. For the first time since his wish had been granted, what he touched did not change, did not harden, did not turn to lifeless gold. Instead, it remained as it was, pure, flowing, eternal. He let out a breath he had been holding for days, a sound halfway between a sob and a sigh. Tears mingled with the river, carried away by the current. The myth tells us that the curse washed from him in that moment. The golden touch, which had clung to his fingers like an invisible poison, melted away into the waters. Some say that from then on, the sands of that riverbed gleamed faintly, golden grains scattered through the mud, a reminder of what had been lost and what had been restored. Whether this detail was born of poetry or of legend, it carries the gentle truth that even mistakes leave traces, that even forgiveness carries memory within it. Midas cupped the water in his hands and drank. The coolness flowed into him, easing the burning thirst that had plagued him. For days he had been surrounded by plenty yet starved. Now, at last, he tasted life again. He bathed his face, letting the river wash over him, cleansing not only his skin but his spirit. The weight upon his chest seemed to lift, slowly but surely, as though the river itself drew it away. He lingered there, letting the water run through his fingers again and again, marveling at the simple joy of touch untainted by greed. Each drop that slipped through his hands was a gift greater than gold, for it was alive, fleeting, and free. He understood then, in a way he never had before, that wealth is nothing compared to the blessing of life itself. When he rose from the riverbank, the man who stood there was not the same as the one who had stumbled into the temple days before. His robes still clung to him, heavy and torn, but within his eyes there was a light renewed. He looked at the world not with hunger, but with gratitude. He had been freed, not only from his curse, but from the blindness of his own desire. Yet the myth does not end here, for Midas still had to return home. He still had to face the empty halls, the daughter frozen in gold, the memory of what his greed had wrought. The cleansing river had given him freedom, but not erasure. His path forward would be one of reckoning, of sorrow tempered with wisdom. The gods had granted him release, but it was up to him to live with the lessons he had been given. As he turned from the river, droplets still clinging to his skin, he carried with him a silence deeper than before. It was not the silence of despair, but the silence of humility, of awe, of reverence for the fragile gift of life. The water had taught him something no throne, no treasure, no golden hall could ever teach, that the most precious things cannot be held, cannot be owned, but must be cherished in their fleeting beauty. And so he began the walk back, each step steady, each breath a quiet prayer of thanks. The river sang behind him, its current flowing on, eternal and unbroken, carrying with it the last remnants of his curse. It would forever remember the touch of a king who had learned too late the folly of his wish, yet who had been granted mercy all the same. The land, the people, and the myths themselves would remember too, passing the tale from voice to voice, bed to bed, night to night, until it became not only the story of a king, but a lesson for all who dreamed of more than they needed. The path back to the palace stretched before Midas like a road both familiar and strange. He had walked it before as a king, proud and eager, dreaming of wealth and glory. Now he walked it as a man who had lost much, who had glimpsed the sharp edge of desire, and who carried the weight of lessons carved deep into his soul. The river's coolness still lingered upon his skin, a reminder of the mercy he had been given. Yet each step closer to the golden gates filled him with unease. For what would he find within those walls? Would the halls echo with silence? Would his daughter still stand frozen, her laughter locked away in lifeless metal? The countryside around him seemed quieter than before. Villagers who had once marveled at the grandeur of their king's wealth now looked upon him with cautious eyes. They had heard whispers of his curse, seen glimpses of strange transformations, and felt the unease that spread from the palace like a shadow. Some turned away, uncertain whether he carried with him a lingering trace of danger. Others watched with pity, sensing that the man before them was no longer the same sovereign who had once boasted of riches. Their silence was not hostile, but heavy, like the stillness of dawn after a storm. Midas himself felt that silence settling over him. It pressed gently but firmly, reminding him of the cost of pride. He no longer imagined the cheers of subjects or the admiration of travelers. He walked with lowered eyes, the ground beneath his feet steady but humbling. The path to the palace was not a triumphal return but a quiet reckoning, a walk into the heart of his mistakes. When the palace came into view, it shone in the distance as though aflame with sunlight. Every column, every gate, every wall glittered faintly with traces of his curse. The golden gleam that once filled him with pride now struck him with sorrow. What had once seemed like splendor now looked like a tomb, cold and unyielding. The closer he drew, the heavier his steps became, as though the weight of his choices pressed against him with every glimmer. He paused at the gates, breathing deeply, steadying himself. These walls had once echoed with music, laughter, the chatter of servants and courtiers. Now, as he entered, there was only quiet. The great halls stood lined with objects that gleamed unnaturally, cups, tables, statues that had once been living things. Even the smallest detail, a flower turned to metal, carried the sting of memory. He walked slowly, his footsteps echoing softly, the sound swallowed quickly by the silence. And there, in the heart of the palace, was the figure he dreaded to see. His daughter, still and silent, her form gleaming with unnatural perfection. For a long moment, he did not move. He simply gazed at her, his chest tightening with grief. He remembered the sound of her laughter, the warmth of her embrace, the light in her eyes. All of it had been stolen by his desire, locked within that cold golden shell. His hands trembled as he reached toward her, then drew back, fearful that the curse might still linger despite the river's mercy. But the myth tells us that mercy, once given, is not half-hearted. The cleansing river had washed the curse away, and now the transformation began to lift. Slowly, like dawn breaking upon the horizon, the golden sheen upon her body softened. The hard, lifeless surface gave way to the softness of skin, the warmth of life, the gentle rise and fall of breath. Her eyes opened, blinking as though waking from a long dream. She looked at her father, and though confusion lay upon her face, there was no hatred, no fear, only the innocence of a child returning from silence. Midas fell to his knees, overwhelmed with relief. Tears streamed freely down his cheeks, and he whispered words of gratitude, words of apology, words that poured out of him like a flood. His daughter touched his face, her small hands warm and alive, and in that touch he felt the full weight of his redemption. No treasure, no crown, no golden throne could ever match the worth of this moment. He had been given back what mattered most, not through power, not through wealth, but through the grace of the gods and the humbling of his own heart. The palace, though still scarred with remnants of his curse, no longer seemed like a prison. It was still filled with golden traces, walls that gleamed too brightly, objects forever frozen in unnatural form, but it also echoed once more with life. Servants returned cautiously, courtiers whispered of miracles, and the halls began to breathe again. Yet Midas himself no longer looked upon the palace as he once had. Where once he saw triumph, he now saw a reminder. Every gleaming corner reminded him of what greed could do. Every golden surface whispered of folly. The palace had become not a treasure house, but a lesson etched in stone and metal. He walked its halls with gentler steps now, his daughter at his side. The weight of kingship remained, the duties of leadership unchanged, yet he carried them differently. He had touched the edge of ruin and returned, and in doing so had found a humility deeper than crowns and thrones. The people would look upon him with new eyes, not as the king of wealth, but as the king who had fallen and risen again, chastened but wiser. And in the stillness of the evening, when the palace glowed faintly in the fading light, Midas would sit and listen to the laughter of his daughter, to the rustle of the wind, to the heartbeat of life itself. All of it, once overlooked, now seemed precious beyond measure. The man who had once wished that all he touched would turn to gold had learned instead that the most valuable things cannot be touched at all, but must be felt with the soul. Thus the return to the palace was not a return to glory, but a return to truth. The halls were quieter, humbler, and filled not with triumph, but with gratitude. And in that gratitude lay a deeper wealth than any mortal could ever hold. In the quiet that followed his return, Midas found himself surrounded not by celebration, but by contemplation. The palace lived again, his daughter breathed and laughed, and the curse had been lifted, yet the air still carried the heavy fragrance of memory. Every golden trace that lingered upon the walls, every object frozen in unnatural brilliance, whispered reminders of the folly that had nearly destroyed him. He could not unmake the past, but he could dwell within its lessons, letting them shape the man he would become. For a king, lessons often arrive too late. Power shields rulers from consequence, and wealth dulls the sharp edge of mistakes. Yet when lessons are carved so deeply, when they strip away pride and pierce the heart, they cannot be ignored. Midas walked his halls each day with new eyes, his gaze softening upon servants he had once overlooked, his voice gentler when he spoke, his presence marked not by grandeur, but by humility. Those who served him began to notice the change. The king who had once demanded more wealth, more splendor, more tribute, now asked only for simplicity, for the comfort of bread, for the laughter of his child, for the peace of an evening without longing. The Greeks who first told this story did not mean for it to end with the lifting of the curse. They wanted their listeners, resting in firelight or drifting towards sleep, to carry the meaning further. The golden touch was more than a myth. It was a mirror, reflecting the restless hunger that stirs in every human heart. It reminded them that desire, left unchecked, can devour joy. It whispered that wealth, when pursued without limit, becomes not a blessing but a chain. And in the gentle cadence of bedtime storytelling, the weight of those lessons settles softly, not as accusation, but as guidance. Midas himself carried that weight in silence. He no longer boasted of gifts, no longer sought to display his riches before foreign guests. Instead, he began to live as one who had been humbled by his own wish. There is a quiet dignity in such humility, a calmness that seeps into every word, every gesture. The courtiers who once flattered him now spoke to him with genuine respect, sensing that he had changed in ways deeper than they could fully name. The people in the villages began to trust again, seeing that the king who had once frightened them with his strange curse now walked among them with gentleness, stopping to listen to their troubles, offering what little he could not in wealth but in kindness. At night, when the halls grew silent and the stars spilled across the sky, Midas often sat in thought. He would gaze at his hands, no longer dangerous, no longer cursed, but still bearing the memory of what they had done. He would close his eyes and hear the river's song, the sound of water washing away the folly of greed. And in that sound, even in memory, there was peace. For water flows endlessly, carrying burdens away, teaching that nothing, no sorrow, no pride, need last forever. The story of Midas teaches that the gifts we seek are not always the gifts we need. He had asked for wealth, but the gods had shown him emptiness. He had reached for splendor, but was given silence. Only when he lost what he cherished most did he see the truth, that love, laughter, and life itself are treasures far beyond the measure of gold. The weight of this realization did not crush him, rather, it reshaped him. Like a sculptor carving stone, sorrow cut away pride until only humility remained. The people around him may not have spoken of it aloud, but they, too, learned through his story. They saw that kings are not beyond error, that even rulers can fall to their knees in supplication, and that even the most powerful can be humbled. They carried these whispers back to their homes, telling the tale in hushed voices as the firelight flickered, letting children drift to sleep with the reminder that desire, though tempting, can be dangerous when left unbridled. And for the listener today, resting perhaps in the quiet of night, the story still holds the same weight. How often do we, like Midas, long for more than we have? How often do we overlook the warmth of the present in search of glittering tomorrows? The legend lingers because it speaks softly to that restless part of us, offering not condemnation but calm wisdom. It reminds us that contentment is not found in what we possess, but in what we cherish, in the simple things we allow ourselves to notice, the breath of evening air, the laughter of loved ones, the quiet rhythm of life as it passes. As Midas lived on, the lesson remained etched not only into his palace, but into his very being. He no longer touched objects with fear, no longer recoiled from the possibility of ruin. Instead, he touched with gratitude, with hands that now gave, comforted, and held, rather than consumed. His daughter's hand in his, warm and alive, was reminder enough of what he had nearly lost. Each embrace, each shared meal, each gentle smile was more precious than crowns or treasures. The curse had been lifted, but its memory had become a guiding star. Thus the weight of lessons is not a burden that crushes, but a balance that steadies. For Midas, it was the quiet anchor of humility, the calm reminder that life is fragile, fleeting, and infinitely more valuable than gold. And for those who hear his story, whether by lamplight in ancient days or in the soft glow of screens now, it is a lullaby of wisdom, soothing, humbling, and gently enduring. In the soft cadence of bedtime narration, we allow these lessons to settle like dust upon still air. They do not press harshly. They simply drift downward, resting upon the heart until morning comes. And in that gentle rest lies the true treasure of the tale, not the glitter of gold, but the golden calm of understanding. In the days and months after the curse was lifted, the kingdom itself seemed to breathe differently. Where once the people had lived under the shadow of whispers, wary of a king whose very touch could destroy, now there was a cautious peace, like the air after a storm has passed. Yet the memory of that storm lingered, etched not only into the golden traces that clung to palace walls, but also into the hearts of the people who had watched events unfold. Myths are never only about the hero or the king. They ripple outward, touching the land, the villages, the humblest of homes. And in this way, the legend of Midas became not just his story, but theirs as well. The farmers who had once carried their grain to the palace for tribute remembered the strange days when their gifts had been taken and turned to lifeless treasure. They spoke quietly of how the curse might have spread, how fields themselves could have been poisoned had the king, not found mercy. When they worked their furrows, they now looked at the soil with new reverence, thankful that the earth still yielded grain and fruit, thankful that their harvests remained alive rather than locked in metal. In their prayers, they whispered not for riches, but for balance. Enough food to feed their families, enough rain to nourish their crops, enough peace to sleep at night. Merchants, too, felt the echo. They had once dreamed of selling golden wares to a king who seemed to crave nothing more than luxury. Yet they had also seen how dangerous such desires could become, how easily wealth could turn to ruin. When they gathered in marketplaces, they told the story in their own way, shaking their heads with knowing sighs. Wealth, they would say, is useful, yes, but not when it consumes the heart. Better to have honest trade, steady work, and fair coin than a curse that robs the world of its warmth. And so the legend shaped not only their dealings with the king, but also their dealings with one another. Children, listening at their mother's sides, absorbed the story as bedtime caution. They heard of the princess, turned to gold, and shivered at the thought of losing their parents to such cold beauty. They heard of the river that washed away the curse and dreamed of waters that could cleanse their own fears. And as they drifted to sleep, the tale nestled into their minds, not as a sharp warning, but as a gentle reminder to be content with simple joys, the taste of bread, the warmth of a blanket, the sound of a lullaby. Even the courtiers, those who had once filled the palace with flattery, could not escape the echo. They had seen the silence of the halls, the terror of their king, the frozen figure of the princess. Many of them whispered among themselves, not only about Midas's folly, but about the dangers of pride in their own lives. If a king could fall so far, could not they as well? They began to tread more carefully, their words less filled with empty praise, their actions more measured. Though ambition never truly disappears from courts, the story of the golden touch had tempered it, if only for a time. The land itself bore traces of the tale. It was said that in the river where Midas washed his hands, golden grains remained scattered through the sand. Travelers who passed that way would sometimes kneel by the water, running their fingers through the current, searching for the glimmer of myth. Whether they found it or not, they carried the tale with them, spreading it beyond the borders of Phrygia, carrying it into Greece, into Rome, into distant lands where stories bloom. And in every place, the meaning shifted slightly, yet the echo remained. The reminder that greed brings sorrow, that mercy brings peace, and that the greatest wealth is often the simplest. The echo also lived in festivals and songs. Priests who served Dionysus told the tale as part of their rituals, weaving it into hymns that praised the god's mercy. Storytellers recited it in the flickering firelight of villages, their voices low and steady, letting listeners drift toward sleep as the lessons of Midas nestled into their dreams. The people may not have remembered every detail, but they remembered the feeling, the unease of the curse, the relief of the cleansing, the calm of humility. And in that memory, the kingdom carried the story like a gentle but steady heartbeat. For Midas himself, these echoes were both burden and blessing. Each time he walked among his people, he saw their cautious eyes, their quiet reverence, their whispered reminders of what he had once done. He knew he would never be free of the story, never be separated from the legend that bore his name. Yet he also understood that this was as it should be. The tale was no longer his alone. It belonged to all who carried it, all who listened, all who let its lessons shape their lives. He had wished for gold, but what he had been given instead was a story, and that story was more enduring than any treasure. In the slow rhythm of bedtime reflection, we see how myths grow beyond their origins. They begin in the sorrow of a single man, but they end in the voices of many, carried through generations, softened into lullabies, sharpened into warnings, reshaped into parables. Midas had been a king, yet the tale made him something more enduring, a lesson told by countless voices, a shadow and a guide, an echo that lived not in gold but in memory. And so the kingdom itself became part of the myth. Its people carried the story in whispers, in songs, in prayers. Its rivers carried the trace of the curse in their sands. Its fields carried the gratitude of farmers who had nearly lost their harvests. Its palace carried the glow of warning within its walls. And through all these echoes, the story of Midas stretched outward, rippling across time, calming restless hearts, teaching in silence as much as in words. For even as we hear it now, drifting toward rest, we are part of that same echo. We are listeners in the long chain of tellings, breathing in the calm rhythm of a tale that began long ago. The kingdom has faded, the palace has crumbled, the people have long since turned to dust, but the echo remains. It reaches across centuries to settle gently upon us, as softly as evening light, as steadily as the flow of a river that never ends. Though the curse had been lifted and the cold touch of gold no longer bound his fingers, Midas could not escape the shadow of regret. It followed him through the palace halls, a presence as familiar as the sound of his own footsteps. In every corridor, he saw reminders of what he had nearly destroyed. Where the walls gleamed with gilded decoration, he remembered the lifeless gleam of his daughter's face. Where feasts were spread with bread and fruit, he remembered the emptiness of meals he could not eat. Though time softened the sharpest edges of grief, the shadow never entirely left. It clung to him, not as punishment from the gods, but as memory, a memory too deeply etched to ever fade. There were moments, quiet ones, when the weight of this shadow pressed heaviest upon him. At night, when the torches were dim and the palace lay in silence, Midas would sit in solitude. The hush of darkness seemed to awaken the echoes of the past. He could almost hear again the crackling stillness of gold spreading through what had once been living, almost see the frozen figure of the child he had loved more than himself. In those hours, he understood that though Dionysus had granted mercy, the god had not erased what had been. Some wounds, after all, are not meant to be undone. They are meant to remind. And yet, regret did not always come with sharpness. Sometimes it arrived like a low mist, gentle and persistent, shaping his thoughts without overwhelming them. It guided him in choices he made for his kingdom, urging him to value life above display, kindness above wealth. When petitions came to him, he weighed them not by profit but by need. When disputes arose, he remembered that no treasure could soothe the heart, only fairness and understanding. In this way, the shadow became not only burden but also teacher. It reminded him of who he had been, and of who he must strive to become. But still, the heart is not so easily quieted. For every lesson learned, there was still an ache that could not be soothed. Midas wondered often whether those around him truly trusted him again. Did his subjects look upon him with gratitude for his change, or did they still whisper with fear of what he had once been? Did his daughter, though restored, carry within her a faint unease when his hand brushed hers? These doubts flickered in him, soft but constant, like embers that refused to go dark. They kept him humble, but they also kept him restless. It is in such shadows that the deepest truths of myth reside. For Midas's tale is not one of simple folly and redemption, but of lingering sorrow. A curse lifted does not erase its trace. Gold washed away does not undo the memory of touch turned deadly. The shadow of regret is what makes the tale resonate, what makes it human. For who among us has not wished to undo some choice, some word, some moment? Who has not felt the soft weight of regret settle into the quiet hours of night? In this, Midas ceases to be only a king of legend. He becomes a mirror of us all. The palace chroniclers noticed this change in their king. Their writings grew quieter, more contemplative, no longer filled with lists of riches and conquests, but with observations of a man tempered by sorrow. They described how he walked more slowly through his gardens, how he lingered near fountains and streams, perhaps remembering the river that had freed him. They wrote of how he spoke less of wealth and more of wisdom, how he listened longer to the counsel of those once ignored. They recorded the subtle signs of a king who carried regret like a cloak, never discarded, but worn with dignity. Even in festivals, when music rose and laughter filled the air, Midas seemed touched by shadow. He smiled, yes, and joined the dances, but his eyes often drifted toward the horizon, as though searching for something lost. It was not despair, nor was it gloom. It was a quiet recognition that joy and sorrow are forever entwined. To have known the deepest error was also to have known the depth of love, for regret is only possible when love has been endangered. In this way, the shadow was not a curse but a companion, one that reminded him of what truly mattered. As the years passed, the story of his touch grew more legendary, but within the man himself, It remained personal, sharp with memory. When others told the tale, they often ended with the cleansing in the river, the lifting of the curse, the mercy of the god. But Midas lived the chapters that followed, the ones rarely spoken. The mornings when he rose heavy with thought, the evenings when he wondered what might have been if he had chosen differently, the silent prayers he whispered not for treasure, but for forgiveness. Those chapters may never have been carved into stone or sung in epic verse, but they were as real as the myth itself. And so we come to understand that legends are not cleanly finished, not neatly tied into endings of pure redemption. They leave shadows, soft and lingering, like the dim glow of twilight after the sun has set. For Midas, that shadow was regret, and though it could not undo the past, it shaped his future with quiet strength. It turned a king once blinded by greed into a man who saw more clearly, even if his vision was tinged with sorrow. And as the story passes into our ears, carried gently in this calm retelling, we too carry that shadow, not as fear, but as understanding. In the quiet years that followed his curse, Midas began to understand that his life had been given a second chance not only for himself, but for others. The gods had shown him mercy, and in that mercy lay responsibility. He could not erase his folly, nor could he undo the pain it had caused, but he could choose to share the lessons he had learned. And so, slowly, he began to speak, not as a king commanding obedience, but as a man who had walked through shadow and returned with wisdom. At first, these lessons came softly, in conversations with his daughter. He would sit with her in the gardens, where once he had turned blossoms into lifeless gold, and he would speak to her of the beauty of simple things. The flower, he would say, is a treasure greater than gold, because it breathes, because it bends toward the sun, because it withers and returns again. Gold is fixed, cold, silent. But life moves, and in its movement lies all its worth. The girl would listen, her young eyes wide, and though she could not remember the moment when she herself had been frozen, she understood the weight of her father's words. In her laughter, in her running steps across the grass, he saw the truth of what he told her. From these intimate lessons, the practice of teaching widened. Courtiers and advisers who once sought riches from him now found themselves gathered to hear reflections instead. In the evenings, when the palace grew still, Midas would summon them not for feasting, but for stories. He spoke of how desire can blind, how greed can hollow the soul, how wealth, when pursued without thought, can destroy what is most loved. At first, the courtiers listened out of duty, nodding politely. But as the seasons passed, they came to listen willingly, drawn not by obligation, but by the calm gravity of a man transformed. The story of his golden touch became not a secret shame, but a shared parable, a living reminder within the palace walls. In the villages, too, his words began to spread. When Midas traveled beyond the palace to walk among his people, he spoke not of taxes or decrees, but of contentment. He reminded farmers that their harvests, though humble, were riches beyond measure. He told merchants that honest trade was worth more than treasure gained through deceit. And he praised craftsmen, whose creations were alive with purpose, unlike the lifeless gleam of gold. These words, simple yet sincere, echoed in marketplaces and fields. Parents began repeating them to children. Storytellers wove them into their tales. Thus the king's regret became the people's wisdom. Over time, these lessons wove themselves into the fabric of his reign. Festivals, once gaudy with displays of wealth, grew gentler in tone. Instead of parading golden ornaments, the people began celebrating the fruits of the earth, the grain that fed them, the wine that warmed them, the songs that bound them together. Priests, recalling the mercy of Dionysus, reminded worshippers that joy was not found in hoarded wealth but in shared abundance. The legend of Midas, once a tale of shame, had softened into a story of growth, one that guided not only a king but a kingdom. And yet, Midas did not present himself as flawless or wise beyond reproach. He spoke openly of his error, telling it not as a boast of transformation but as a confession. "I was blinded," he would say, "and in my blindness, I nearly lost all that I loved. Do not be like me, chasing shadows of gold while life itself slips away. Learn from my folly, so you need not suffer the same." In this way, his vulnerability became his strength. By admitting his weakness, he gave others permission to reflect on their own. It is said that some of his words were written down, etched onto tablets, and passed from hand to hand, though time has long since erased their marks. What remains is the echo of the lessons themselves. That wealth without love is emptiness, that desire unchecked is dangerous, and that true treasure lies not in possessions but in presence, in kindness, in the warmth of human bonds. These are the lessons that outlasted his reign, carried forward by generations who remembered not just the curse, but the wisdom that followed. And so, the shadow of regret that once haunted Midas became a lantern, lighting paths for others. Where once his hands brought only coldness, now his words brought warmth. Where once he had turned life to lifelessness, now he turned sorrow into understanding. His tale, repeated across years and lands, became not merely a warning but also a guide. The lessons passed on were not heavy with fear but gentle with hope, allowing listeners to settle into reflection, to breathe more deeply, to find comfort in the quiet truth that mistakes can lead to wisdom if one is willing to learn. For myths endure not because they tell of perfect heroes, but because they remind us that even in folly, there can be growth. Midas's curse did not vanish from memory, but neither did his lessons. And as we listen now, letting the calm cadence of the story wrap around us, we too inherit those lessons. We, like his people, are invited to carry them forward, not as rigid commandments, but as soft reminders, like a voice in the night guiding us gently toward peace. Age came to Midas as it comes to all, not with sudden force, but with the steady passage of seasons. The once strong figure who had walked his palace halls with pride now moved more slowly, his steps careful, his breath carrying the faint rasp of years. His hair, once thick and dark, grew silver at the temples, and his hands, which had once been feared for their deadly touch, bore the lines and softness of time. Yet it was not sorrow that accompanied these changes, but acceptance. Midas had lived through folly and regret, through shadow and lesson, and now he entered a new chapter, the waning of a king. The palace itself reflected this change. Once a place of glittering displays, it had grown simpler under his guidance. Decorations that boasted wealth were replaced with tapestries depicting scenes of nature, rivers, fields, orchards, flocks of birds. The gardens, too, became his sanctuary. Midas often spent long hours there, watching the slow cycle of blooming and fading, learning again and again that beauty lies not in permanence, but in change. To visitors, he seemed almost a different man from the ruler of years past, less a king seated upon a throne and more a wise elder whose presence calmed those around him. As his reign lengthened, he began to step back from the demands of rule. Advisors, trained in his new philosophy of moderation and kindness, shouldered more of the kingdom's daily burdens. His daughter, now grown, walked beside him not only as child but as confidant, her laughter a reminder of the life he had nearly lost. Often, when they walked together, she would tease him gently about his past, softening his regret with warmth. "You wished for gold," she would say, plucking a blossom from a branch, "and yet see how much better this flower is." And Midas would smile, nodding in agreement, for no riches could match the gift of her voice. Among his people, his presence became symbolic more than active. Farmers, merchants, and artisans no longer feared their king's touch, but honored his story. When they saw him walk through the markets, leaning perhaps a little heavier on his staff, they bowed not out of fear, but with quiet respect. For they knew that he was not a perfect ruler, but a man who had learned, and who had tried to share that learning. His frailty did not diminish him. Rather, it made him more beloved. To see a king who had erred and grown, who now moved with humility, was to see a reflection of their own lives. In festivals, where once he might have stood tall and commanded the crowd, he now sat quietly at the edge, watching the dances with contentment. Children would approach him, drawn by the gentleness in his gaze, and he would tell them small stories, of rivers that cleanse, of flowers that outshine gold, of love that endures beyond error. These tales, simple and soothing, carried no command, only guidance. And as the children listened, their eyelids heavy in the warm light of evening, they too became keepers of the wisdom he passed on. Yet even in these softened years, the shadow of regret remained. It did not haunt him with sharpness as before, but lived within him as part of his being. Sometimes, in the stillness of dawn, he would sit by his window and think of the day when he had first received the golden gift. He remembered the rush of triumph, the thrill of power, and he shook his head at the blindness of that younger self. "What folly we embrace," he would murmur, "when we believe we know what will make us happy." But he no longer spoke with bitterness. Instead, he spoke with the calm understanding that only age brings, that every life is marked by missteps, and that wisdom often grows from the soil of sorrow. As he aged, he also thought more of the gods. Dionysus, who had once answered his desperate plea, remained in his prayers. But Midas prayed not for gifts, nor for wealth, nor even for forgiveness. Instead, he prayed in gratitude, for the mercy that had spared him, for the daughter who still walked by his side, for the river whose waters still flowed, carrying away not only curses but the heaviness of memory. His faith deepened, not as a ritual of duty, but as a quiet rhythm of thankfulness. Stories of his reign spread beyond Phrygia. Travelers carried them into Greece, where poets reshaped them, and into distant lands, where the details shifted like a river's current. Some told of his folly alone, painting him as a warning. Others told of his change, presenting him as a sage. Still others, not knowing his full tale, wove fragments into new legends. Midas heard of these tellings, and though he sometimes wished the whole truth might be remembered, he accepted that stories live their own lives once they leave the teller's mouth. The myth was no longer his alone. It belonged to all who heard it. The waning years also brought him closer to silence. Where once he had filled halls with proclamations, now he spoke less, choosing words carefully, letting pauses stretch long between them. His court grew accustomed to these silences, learning that in them there was meaning. For in stillness, Midas had found peace. He no longer sought to fill the world with his will. He sought only to listen, to the rustle of trees, the laughter of children, the quiet of his own heart. And so, as time moved forward, Midas became less king and more elder, less ruler and more storyteller. His power no longer rested in decrees, but in presence. His wealth no longer lay in treasure, but in memory, in wisdom, in the lives he had touched. The man who had once nearly lost everything to greed now lived in quiet abundance, his kingdom steady, his people content, his own heart softened by years. The waning of a king is not an end, but a transformation. It is the slow dimming of a light that once burned fiercely, replaced by the steady glow of embers that warm rather than dazzle. In Midas's twilight, we see not failure, but fulfillment. His reign, marked by error and redemption, sorrow and wisdom, became a parable not only for his people, but for all who would one day hear his name. And as we listen now, in the calm rhythm of bedtime telling, we feel that same twilight settling around us, gentle and reassuring, guiding us toward rest. The final years of Midas's life passed as gently as autumn winds. The man who had once known the thrill of power and the terror of curse now lived in stillness, watching the seasons turn with quiet reverence. His strength, once enough to command armies and courtly halls, grew faint. Each step became slower, each breath more deliberate, yet he did not resist the change. For he had learned long ago that all things fade, the flower, the river's ripple, the light of day. And in that fading lay not sorrow, but truth. In the palace gardens, where once he had feared to touch even the smallest bloom, he now sat for long hours, letting the fragrance of blossoms wrap around him. He would trace the lines of a petal with his eyes, not his hands, and smile at the delicacy of its form. Servants often found him there, seated in silence, his gaze fixed not on wealth or grandeur, but on the smallest of living beauties. It seemed as though he was preparing himself, training his heart to release the world gently as it had been given to him. His daughter, now a woman grown, remained his comfort. She walked with him in the twilight hours, guiding him through corridors when his steps faltered, sitting at his side when nights grew long. Their bond was deepened not only by blood but by the memory of what they had endured together, the shadow of gold that had nearly stolen her, the mercy that had restored her. She often brought him fresh flowers, laying them across his table, a quiet reminder of the lesson he had taught her long ago, that life, in its fragility, is the true treasure. When he looked upon her, he saw not only his child, but the living proof that redemption had meaning. The people, too, sensed the nearing of an ending. They spoke of their king with reverence, not because he had conquered vast lands or gathered endless riches, but because he had lived a story that touched their hearts. In the markets, old men told children of the golden touch and the river that washed it away. In temples, priests spoke of the mercy of Dionysus, weaving Midas's tale into their hymns. And in distant villages, storytellers spun the legend anew, their voices soft in the firelight, their listeners drifting to sleep with images of gold and river water in their dreams. Already, the man was becoming more myth than flesh, his life dissolving into the timeless current of story. Midas himself seemed to sense this transformation. One evening, as the sun dipped low, he said to his advisors, "I am no longer only a king. I am a tale, and tales do not die." His words were not proud, but accepting. He knew that his life, his folly, his regret, his redemption, had been given to him not to hoard, but to pass on. The gods had given him a gift once, and though it had been curse as much as blessing, it had become something larger than himself. His touch had turned things to gold. His story had turned error into wisdom. The end came not with violence or suddenness, but with the gentleness of a candle's flame lowering toward its wick. Midas grew weaker, his days filled with longer silences, his nights with deeper dreams. He spent more time by the river where his curse had been lifted, carried there in a litter by attendants who knew how much that place meant to him. Sitting at the banks, he would watch the water flow, always flowing, always carrying away the weight of the past. Sometimes he would dip his hand in, not to cleanse, but to remember, feeling the cool current move between his fingers. "Here," he whispered, "I was given another chance. And here, I give thanks." When at last he passed, it was said that he left with a smile upon his lips, as though he had seen, in his final moment, the truth he had sought all his life. His daughter wept beside him, yet she also knew he had found peace. The palace fell into mourning, but the sorrow was tempered with reverence. For they understood that they had lived beneath a king who had not only erred but learned, not only stumbled but risen, not only sought gold but found wisdom. His reign was remembered not for conquest or wealth, but for the story that grew from his curse. And so, Midas faded into legend. His name became less that of a man and more that of a lesson. In Greece, poets retold his folly as warning. In Rome, philosophers spoke of his transformation as parable. In distant lands, his tale mingled with other myths, his golden touch echoing through centuries. Sometimes his story was sharpened into satire, sometimes softened into bedtime lullaby, but always it remained. The man was gone, but the myth endured, as myths always do. Even now, as we listen, we carry that same legend. We hear not only of the golden touch, but of the man who learned from it. We hear not only of error, but of change. We feel the fading of his life not as tragedy, but as gentle reminder that all things pass, and in passing, they give meaning. Midas has become a shadow on the walls of history, a whisper in the songs of poets, a calm story told in the night. And in that fading, there is beauty, because to fade into legend is to remain forever. When Midas slipped quietly into the embrace of death, his presence did not vanish. His footsteps faded from palace floors, his voice no longer echoed through the halls of Phrygia, yet his name traveled further than his kingdom's borders. For what the man left behind was not a crown, nor a treasury, but a story, one that the world carried with it like a soft candle flame, passed from hand to hand, age to age. The afterlife of Midas was not lived in shadowed underworlds, but in words, in myths, in the steady current of memory that never ceased to flow. The Greeks, who had always been keepers of tales, were the first to shape his story into lesson. Around hearths and in marketplaces, poets and wanderers spoke of Midas not as a king of wealth, but as a man of error redeemed. They described the gift of gold that became curse, the river that washed it away, and the wisdom that grew from folly. His tale was placed beside those of Icarus, Narcissus, and Echo, stories of mortals who erred, who suffered, who revealed through their struggles something essential about being human. To the Greeks, Midas became more than a ruler. He became a mirror of themselves. Philosophers, too, found meaning in his life. In the quiet courtyards of Athens, teachers reminded their pupils that true value lies not in what glitters, but in what breathes. They spoke of the paradox of wealth, that to desire endlessly is to be endlessly empty. Midas, they said, was not to be mocked, but to be understood. For who among mortals has not wished, at some moment, for more than enough? And who has not learned, in the end, that too much may become too heavy? Thus his story, though ancient, remained fresh with every retelling, because it spoke to a truth that does not wither. When Rome rose in power and gathered Greece into its embrace, the tale of Midas traveled there as well. Roman poets adapted it to their own voices, embellishing details, weaving the golden touch into odes and fables. They found in his legend a warning suited for empire, that greed and excess could corrode even the strongest of states. Midas became a symbol not only of a man's folly, but of a nation's peril. His story lingered in Roman banquets, where guests laughed uneasily at the thought of food turned to gold, and in Roman schools, where students copied lines about him as exercises in Latin verse. Even as empires rose and fell, Midas endured, shimmering faintly in the ink of scribes. Centuries passed, and the story journeyed further, carried across lands by merchants, pilgrims, and wanderers. In the Middle Ages, his name appeared in manuscripts copied by patient monks. They painted him sometimes as fool, sometimes as warning, but always as figure worth remembering. Illuminated letters glowed with his image, a crown upon his head, golden light flowing from his fingers. Children in faraway villages heard his tale not as Greek myth, but as moral fable, softened into bedtime rhythm, teaching them that the hunger for riches blinds the heart. In some tellings, the details shifted. The river that cleansed him was given new names. The gods who cursed and forgave him were replaced by saints or spirits. Yet the essence remained. Every culture, in retelling, kept the heart of his legend, the touch that seemed blessing but was curse, and the wisdom that followed. Myths survive not because they are fixed, but because they bend, because they find new forms for each ear that listens. Midas's story did not vanish because it did not cling to one truth. Instead, it offered many. In later centuries, poets of the Renaissance rediscovered him. They wove his golden touch into plays and verses, sometimes comic, sometimes tragic. Painters too took interest, filling their canvases with images of a king whose hands gleamed too brightly. The myth became both entertainment and meditation, at once light-hearted tale and profound reflection. In candlelit theaters, audiences watched actors pretend to turn bread and wine into lifeless treasure, and they laughed. But behind the laughter was recognition, a quiet sense that greed was not only ancient but eternal. Even in modern times, Midas remains with us. His name has become a phrase, the Midas touch, spoken often without thought of its origin, used to praise success, to marvel at prosperity. Yet beneath the surface of the phrase lingers the original warning, that not all that glitters is gift, and that fortune, unchecked, may turn to burden. Thus, though centuries separate us from the man who once walked the gardens of Phrygia, we still carry him, often without knowing, in the words we speak and the lessons we repeat. And so the afterlife of Midas is unlike that of kings who vanish into dust, their names forgotten beneath stone. His is the afterlife of myth, a life lived again and again in the breath of storytellers, in the ink of writers, in the listening of children who drift into dreams. He walks no more in palaces, yet he wanders in imagination. His golden touch gleams not on objects, but on the pages of history, the minds of those who recall him. To fade into legend is not to die, but to transform. Midas, once man, became meaning. His hunger became caution, his sorrow became song, his redemption became hope. And so long as there are hearts that question what is truly valuable, so long as there are voices that retell stories in the night, Midas will not fade. He will sit among the eternal company of myth, where every ending is beginning, and every silence is filled with memory. The story of King Midas, though draped in gold and shadow, is not merely about a king of Phrygia or a forgotten age of gods. It is about us, about the pulse of desire that beats in every human chest, and the delicate balance between what we crave and what we truly need. Myths endure because they are mirrors, showing us pieces of ourselves that words alone cannot. And in the quiet telling of Midas's tale, one hears more than history or legend. One hears the rhythm of human longing, the echo of choices made, the sigh of wisdom learned too late. When Midas stretched out his hands to grasp the golden gift, he believed, as many of us do, that abundance would solve every sorrow. He thought that in riches lay safety, joy, and contentment. Yet the world, through his fate, whispers otherwise. Riches without measure are not shelter, but burden. A banquet of gold is no feast at all. The myth is gentle but firm in its teaching, that to mistake glitter for goodness is to walk into emptiness. And still, how often do we walk that path? Even now, in ages far removed from Midas, we build lives filled with wanting. We imagine happiness will come with more wealth, more status, more possessions. Like Midas, we hope for a touch that transforms all things into symbols of prosperity. But the myth asks us to pause. It asks us to wonder whether the treasure we seek will nourish or starve us. It asks whether the banquet before us might already be enough. The eternal lesson of Midas rests not only in the danger of greed, but in the possibility of redemption. For he was not abandoned forever. When his golden gift turned to curse, when he saw his own daughter frozen into lifeless statue, the weight of his error brought him to humility. And in that humility, he prayed. He washed his hands in the river, and the gods, who can be both stern and merciful, forgave him. The tale reminds us that mistakes, even grave ones, do not seal our fate. To recognize error, to turn back, to seek cleansing, these acts restore balance. This is not only the lesson of Midas, but of life itself, that wisdom often comes through sorrow, and redemption through humility. Another thread runs through the myth as well, subtle and soft. It is the reminder that true wealth is not what can be held, but what can be felt. Bread that nourishes, water that quenches thirst, the warmth of touch, the laughter of loved ones. These are riches beyond measure. Midas, who once sat among treasures, learned too late that the simplest joys were greater than gold. Yet his tale allows us to learn in his place, to awaken before our own hands turn what is living into what is lifeless. Philosophers, poets, and storytellers have drawn on this lesson across the centuries. They remind us that desire is not wrong in itself, but untempered desire blinds. To wish is human, but to wish without wisdom is peril. The story whispers that balance is the key, that joy is found not in abundance, but in harmony, not in endless wealth, but in enough. To be content with the sufficiency of life is a deeper treasure than any hoard. As we listen to Midas's tale in the quiet of night, it becomes more than story. It becomes meditation. Each word is like a soft ripple across water, reminding us that what we hold dear is often already within our reach. We need not curse ourselves with endless hunger. We need not mistake shine for sustenance. We need only to see with clear eyes the richness of what is simple, what is near, what is alive. The eternal lesson, then, is gentle. It is not shouted by gods, nor carved in stone. It comes like a hush at dusk, like the silence that falls when a long story ends. It tells us to cherish touch that warms, food that feeds, voices that comfort. It tells us to be cautious with wishes, for what we desire may become more than we can bear. And it tells us, too, that forgiveness is always possible, that even the weight of gold can be lifted when one seeks renewal. And so, King Midas, though long gone, lingers as teacher. His golden touch is not gift, but guide, a shimmering reminder of the path we might take if we forget what truly matters. His sorrow is not wasted, for it becomes our wisdom. His redemption is not singular, for it offers us hope. To remember Midas is to remember ourselves, to pause in our wanting, to soften our hands, to live not for gold, but for grace. And as we drift deeper into the rhythm of the story, we may feel that lessons settle quietly within us, like a lantern lit in the dark. The tale does not demand, it does not rush, it simply rests, like a lullaby of memory, urging us to see that in every ordinary moment lies treasure enough. The tale of King Midas has carried us across golden halls, through gardens that glimmered with lifeless beauty, into rivers where curses were washed away, and across centuries where poets, philosophers, and dreamers kept his name alive. Now, as the story begins to settle into silence, it offers us one final gift, not of treasure, not of wealth, but of stillness. For myths are not only meant to be heard, they are meant to be felt. They linger long after the telling, like soft echoes that drift through the mind, shaping thought, shaping dream. As you rest now, imagine once more the image of Midas, not as king of grandeur, nor as figure of folly, but simply as a man who longed, erred, and learned. Picture him in twilight, no crown upon his head, no gold upon his hands, sitting beside the river that freed him. The water runs clear, the air is quiet, and in his eyes there is a calm acceptance. His story is not only his own, it is yours, mine, ours. For we too walk through moments of wanting, through choices made, through lessons learned. Let the rhythm of his journey move gently through you. The golden touch that once dazzled and destroyed becomes a symbol, a soft reminder that what shines brightest may not always nourish. Think of your own life, of the simple treasures that rest near you even now, breath filling your lungs, the steady beat of your heart, the quiet comfort of the present moment. These are riches beyond measure, and they require no magic, no wish, no divine gift. They are here, waiting to be cherished. And perhaps, in remembering Midas, you may also remember forgiveness. For his tale is not of endless punishment, but of redemption. Even when he had turned joy to sorrow, he was not left to despair forever. The gods showed mercy, and the river carried away his burden. In that, there is hope for every heart, that no mistake, however heavy, is final. There is always a path back to balance, to peace, to stillness. As night deepens around you, let the story soften your thoughts. Let the weight of the day wash away, as Midas's curse was washed in the river. Whatever worries you carry, whatever golden burdens seem too heavy, allow them to drift, to dissolve, to be lifted by the current of time. You need hold nothing now. You need only rest. The story of Midas reminds us, too, of the gentleness hidden in endings. For every ending, like his golden touch, transforms into beginning. Though his hands no longer shimmered, though his palace no longer gleamed, he found life again in what was simple, in what was true. And so too do we, each night, when we set aside the day and close our eyes. Sleep is not loss, but renewal, not silence, but song unspoken. It is the river that cleanses, the gift that restores. In this quiet moment, feel the calmness gathering around you. The story has slowed, the words have softened, and the world beyond the tale seems distant, hushed. Allow yourself to follow the rhythm, to drift with it, to let go of thought and tension. Just as Midas surrendered his gift, you too may surrender the weight of wakefulness, trusting that what awaits is gentler, kinder, and full of peace. Remember that myths are not locked in the past. They breathe each time they are told, each time they are heard. Tonight, Midas lives once more, not in Phrygia, not in the courts of Greece or Rome, but here, in your imagination, in the quiet unfolding of this story. And as you carry his lesson into dream, it becomes part of you, like a soft thread woven into the fabric of your rest. So let the closing of this tale be not an ending, but an invitation. An invitation to see your life with new eyes, to notice the treasures already present, to walk gently in the world with hands unburdened. An invitation to find peace in simplicity, joy in the ordinary, rest in the present. And most of all, an invitation to sleep, to let go, to trust that the night will cradle you as the river cradled Midas's release. The story has been told. The words now quiet. The golden light has dimmed into twilight, and twilight into night. Rest in the hush of this moment, knowing that you are enough, that you have enough, that within you is a wealth no curse can tarnish. Close your eyes, let the breath steady, let the heart slow. The myth of Midas will linger as dream, soft and distant, while you drift deeper into the gentle river of sleep. And now, the story has ended. The river has stilled, the golden halls have faded, and the voice of Midas drifts into silence. What remains is quiet, an echo, a breath, a tender calm that settles over you like a soft blanket. All journeys, even those told in myth, arrive here at last, in stillness. The tale of the golden touch is complete, and yet its meaning lingers, shimmering faintly, like starlight on water. You have walked through his life, seen his longing, felt his sorrow, and discovered his redemption. And in doing so, you have walked also through your own reflections, your own heart, your own gentle understanding of what matters. Now there is no need to hold the story in thought. It has done its work. It has given its lesson. Let it drift into memory, soft and light, as you allow yourself to rest. The night is deepening. The air is hushed. Imagine the world outside your window softening into silence. The stars are steady in the sky, patient and calm, watching over all who sleep. The moon casts a silver glow, a reminder that light does not vanish even in darkness. And within this quiet, you too are held, safe and at peace. With each breath, feel yourself sinking more deeply into comfort. Inhale the coolness of the night. Exhale the weight of the day. Inhale calm. Exhale tension. Each breath is like a gentle wave, carrying you further from wakefulness, further into dream. There is no hurry, no demand, no need to hold on to thought. The story has been told, and all that remains is rest. Picture again the river where Midas found release. Its waters move slowly, endlessly, carrying away all burdens. Let it be your river now. Imagine dipping your hands into its cool current, feeling every worry, every heaviness wash away. The river accepts it all and carries it gently into distance. What is left is only lightness, only ease, only stillness. As you lie here, know that you are surrounded by peace. The world beyond may be busy, but here, in this moment, there is nothing but calm. The rhythm of the story has slowed, and the rhythm of your body has followed. Your breath is steady. Your heart is gentle. Sleep is near, waiting to gather you into its arms. The voice of myth has guided you here, and now it fades, like twilight fading into night. What remains is the soft awareness that you are enough, that you are safe, that you are loved. Whatever gold the world may chase, whatever burdens it may place upon your shoulders, here you are free. Here you may simply rest, trusting that morning will come in its time, bringing light anew. So let go, gently, like leaves drifting on a stream. Let your thoughts soften, let your body grow heavy, let your eyes close fully. Feel the embrace of night cradling you. Feel the gift of sleep arriving, not rushed, not forced, but natural, inevitable, like dawn following dusk. Good night, dear listener. May your dreams be gentle. May your rest be deep. May your heart wake in morning light refreshed, renewed, at peace. For now, there is nothing more to do, nothing more to think, nothing more to hold. Only sleep, only silence, only the soft hush of night. Farewell to Midas, farewell to his story, farewell to wakefulness. Let the final words dissolve into quiet, leaving only the steady rhythm of breath, the slow drift into dream, the tender gift of rest. Good night, good night, good night.